that came to you. Now I'm going to have to backtrack a bit and talk a little bit about the history of the Chinese Revolution, just to put into some kind of context. So in 1911, China had a revolution, basically led by a guy named Sun Yat-sen. Now, Western historians kind of regard him as an absurd figure, but he's a revered figure both in China and in Taiwan. Both the Chinese nationalists and the Chinese communists look at him as a revered figure. He's the father of modern China. He was a Chinese revolutionary leader. He had contradictory, sort of confused ideas, but there were like 8 or 9 uprisings were attempted. They never caught on. And Sun Yat-sen was in the U.S. actually fundraising among Chinese Americans or Chinese immigrants in the U.S. when he heard news that there was a successful uprising. He got back to China as soon as he could. He was apparently captured by the British. They were going to turn him over to the Qing, who were going to execute him. It's an interesting story, but they finally relented to let him go. There was a big campaign. They let him go. Okay, so what happened is, why previous uprisings did not succeed, but the 1911 uprising did succeed, is the Qing, who everyone hated by that time, they nationalized the railroads. They put off industrializing or modernizing China as long as they could. They were ultra-obscurantists. They wanted to stay in the past. But there was some railroad industrialization towards the end of that period, and there was a railroad system was built. The Qing didn't really pay for it. It was funded by the local peasant associations, workers' associations, local elites as well, landlords, provinces, provincial governments. So the Qing nationalized the railroad. It sounds progressive, but actually wasn't. It ripped off these local investors who would lose everything. Originally, the Qing central government wasn't going to compensate anyone for this. Then they worked out some compensation scheme, but everyone who was really, really pissed, and that was like the last straw. So these local groups, wide-ranging elites or peasant associations, wide-ranging groups decided to finally throw in their lot with the rebels. And the 1911 revolution succeeded. The militias developed, and they were formed, and they fought against the Qing. It took about a year from fight with some southern China to the north. It took about a year to overthrow the Qing. A pivotal thing in overthrowing the Qing was a guy named Yuan Shikai. Yuanshishkai in English. He was a pretty crappy, horrible guy. He was a Qing commander. He was a reactionary, crushed what they called the 100 Days Reform, a reform movement. He crushed it. He was kind of reactionary. He was also extreme opportunist. He led this Western army. The Qing had these bannermen, these ancient tribal armies, but they also had a modern westernized army. And he was the commander of their main Western army and westernized army. And he made a secret deal of sorts with Sun Yat-sen. Said, yeah, I'll support you guys. I'll switch sides if you make me president. That was basically, I'm being kind of blunt about it, that was basically the deal. So yeah, Sun said okay. And he was a really lousy judge of character, but Sun Yat-sen said, yeah, okay. So this guy switched sides. The army went over to the Qing. And Sun resigned. Not right away, but a year or so later, Yuan Shikai became president of the Republic of China, the First Republic of China. And the year would be 1915. Yuan Shikai was president. He made himself, or tried to make himself, emperor and found a new dynasty. This would mean there'd be no accountability, be another royal family, and it was an intensely unpopular idea. The idea that the time for dynasties had passed. We want to modernize the country. We want a republic. We want to modernize Western ideas. It was an intensely unpopular. His family was against it. His sons turned against him. It was an intensely unpopular idea, and he couldn't hold it. So he was forced to resign. He died a little while later. He was a broken man. He failed. He was considered like he betrayed the republic. He was an extreme opportunist. Years later, there was an incident. I forget the details. One of his elder son was forced. Some political faction he was forced to dig up disinter his father's body and urinate on it. I'm not making this up. You won't find the history books, but several people in China told me this. Interesting story. So, that was Yuan Shikai. Now, the upshot why I shared this story is because this led after Yuan Shikai resigned, or made himself emperor, his failed bid to become emperor, failed. All hell broke loose. The authority of the central government was basically wrecked. This led to the warlord period in the late teens and most of the 1920s. This led to the warlord period. Huge period of chaos. Okay, cutting across that from another direction came what's called the May 5th movement. The part of the Treaty of Versailles, which ended World War I. Woodrow Wilson, U.S. president, was really big about self-determination of nations and democracy and all that. But the Treaty of Versailles, the treaties which ended the First World War, Shandong, the Shandong region, northeast China, is like a peninsula-shaped place. It was the German concessions. The Germans controlled that area. And this Treaty of Versailles or other treaties basically gave Shandong to the Japanese. And Chinese people were outraged. There was a mass protest movement led by students originally in Beijing. They swept all over China. This made the warlords feel kind of awkward because they wanted to look like Chinese patriots, but they're also helping and conniving with the Japanese, so it put them in kind of an awkward spot. Anyway, this movement turned to a major intellectual reform movement. They were fiercely hated Confucianism as official ideology of China for about 2,000 years. They wanted to get rid of Confucius, get rid of this old, archaic, obscureness thinking, and they were interested in Darwin, Voltaire, Marx, progressive European thought, Western thought, and this was a huge influence in China. One of the main big things that came out of that was the Chinese Communist Party, which was founded in Chinese Communist Party was founded in 1921. And I believe in Shanghai there was a conference and founded in 1921. Okay. Meanwhile, the warlord period, talk about China collapse into warlordism, the Sun Yat-sen and a small group around him had gone to Guangzhou, or was it Canton? It's a booming business city in southern China. It's Guangzhou today. In English, it's Canton. They relocated, Sun Yat-sen and this movement relocated to Canton, and they surprisingly pushed out the local warlord and established a base there, and closely cooperated with the communists. Now, the Comintern, the Communist International, according to Moscow, they really basically ordered the communists to work with the nationals, the Kuomintang or the KMT. There was a lot of resistance. The KMT, Chinese nationalists, was mixed. They had some social revolutionaries. They also were increasingly dominated by the landlord class. The officers, the military officers in the military it educated young men who education was a monopoly of the landlords, the elite. They came from landlord families, and also the movement was increasingly supported by Shanghai bankers. So they were mixed. There were some danger signals. Kuomintang was dominated by the enemy class, so basically it's bound to be a collision. So there was a lot of pushback. The Soviet leadership said, yeah, you have to work, said to the new Communist Party, you have to work with these people, and they eventually did. Okay, and they did that. That was the party line. So there was the military. The communists in the Soviet Union helped train the Kuomintang army. Seriously, they gave a lot of training. There's a Whampoa military academy, which led by Zhou Enlai, became the number 2 guy in the Communist Party. They trained the Kuomintang army, as bizarre as it sounds. There were some danger signals. Okay, Sun Yat-sen, he died. I don't remember what year he died. There was a guy named Chiang Kai-shek, who's a huge figure in the story. Started out as a Shanghai gangster, in Shanghai. I don't know the whole story. He eventually became a military officer, had like a second career, like a ramrod straight military officer. He joined the Kuomintang KMT army, worked his way up. He eventually married Sun Yat-sen's daughter, since he was the son-in-law of Chiang Kai-shek, and he became number 2 guy. When Chiang Kai-shek died, he took over the movement. And he kind of played off the left and right, kind of pretended to be a leftist. He went to Moscow, and Russia. He apparently was a Comintern delegate. He made like he was a communist himself, but he quickly pivoted away from that. There were lots of danger signals. I believe it was 1924 where Chiang Kai-shek had a coup against the communists in Canton and kicked them out, basically expelled them. This was a huge bombshell. No one expected. There were some danger signals, but. Okay, then the Comintern in Moscow said, we still have to work with this guy. I know it doesn't look good. we still have to work with this guy. And they tried to cooperate. The communist movement tried to cooperate. It really boomed among the small Chinese working class. The communists were very popular within certain elements. They were huge. In some areas, they had some influence. Said, we got to work with these guys. We got to work with these nationals. So Sun Yat-sen, before he died, had planned like what they called the Great Northern Anti-Bandit Extermination Campaign, basically to subdue these warlords, travel from Canton north, conquer these warlords, and unify China, unified state, crush the warlords who were tearing the country apart. And Sun died. Chiang continued this plan in 1926, 1927, began the campaign, got to Shanghai, and the working class of Shanghai, on orders from the communists, welcomed them. The gates of the city were open, they welcomed them. And basically what happened is they were massacred. The nationalists, they allowed organized crime groups to massacre them, then they did it themselves. They beheaded, people in the streets of Shanghai. We don't know how many tens of thousands, people, maybe hundreds of thousands of people were massacred, were killed. This almost wiped out the communist movement. It wiped them out as an urban movement. So it was an enormous catastrophe. So the remnants of the communist movement fled into the countryside. They kind of evolved into a peasant-based movement, a different type of movement. One direction, future direction could go. Mao Zedong, who was one of the co-founders, led what's called the Autumn Harvest Uprising in Hunan Province, this near Fujian province, led this Autumn Harvest Uprising against the Kuomintang. It was crushed after a few months, but it did show a different direction the party, the communist movement, could go in. And there were factions and lots of debates, but Mao eventually came to a leadership position. He was in some ways a political genius, and I'm not by any means a Maoist. He was a political genius. He forced out the pro-Comintern elements in the movement, a group called the 28 Bolsheviks, who were very pro-Soviet. They were kicked out, and he got control, the independent control of it, while still remaining loyal to the Comintern. He was able to pull this off. Anyway, he fled the big fighting between the nationalists and the communists. Chiang Kai-shek's regime had an alliance with Nazi Germany. Not making this up, had a close alliance with Nazi Germany. They sent over advisors. This alliance was broken when the Nazis had an alliance with Japan. Okay, so yeah, Hitler sent over some Wehrmacht generals, some advisors. There was Hunts von Seek was a guy I remember, and they had this blockhouse strategy, like anti-guerrilla strategy against the communists, which was actually fairly successful. It kept pushing them. And there was the epic Long March. The communists had a long march through partly western China, inhospitable territory, to Yunnan, which is a very kind of remote, very dry, kind of hard scrabble region, northern Shanxi province, kind of not far from the border of Mongolia, kind of remote, and they had an enclave there for a while. Chiang Kai-shek came in to finally finish them off, but he was basically, he was kidnapped by his own generals. Chiang Kai-shek was much more interested in fighting the Chinese. During this time, the Japanese were increasingly encroaching into China. They'd taken Manchuria. They were more and more encroaching, and Chiang Kai-shek really did nothing. He was more interested in fighting the communists. This was going on for a while. Okay, so that's the situation. That's the revolution, and because there was a Chinese Civil War from 1927 to really 1949, or in some ways it's still going on now.